And I'm Dani Makous. I am Policy Director and Senior Researcher at BEI or Building Electrification Institute. Um, we predominantly work with city governments on an equitable decarbonization transition for our buildings. And my coworker Caytie is also on the call and may jump in during Q&A or in the chat if questions come up. Um, yeah, so for today's presentation, we're going to focus on rental housing upgrades. BEI is more and more working in our cities to de-silo across housing and energy sectors, and we've been learning a lot and continue to learn a lot. So we're hoping some of our lessons can translate into the work that many of you all are working on. And so this is a very meaty topic. There's a lot we won't be able to dig into, but we're going to start off by describing some key concepts and trends around the state of rental housing, and then share key considerations around funding and financing retrofit projects in rental housing. And I think it may be helpful if I get through my presentation content, but I have about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. And if folks have questions during the presentation, feel free to put those in the chat. Caytie may be able to respond or we'll get to them during the Q&A. Awesome. So starting out with the state of rental housing in US cities. Across the US, or across the US cities, I should say, approximately 5 to 10% of rental housing is regulated under long-term affordability restrictions, and about 90 to 95% is on the private rental market. Of course, the exact breakdown varies by city, but this is just to give you a sense of proportions. And there are many, many terms and categories around types of housing, which we could discuss all day long. But just for the sake of our focus today, we're mostly going to be referring to these two buckets. So when I say subsidized affordable housing, I'm referring to rental housing subject to typically multi-decade affordability restrictions that are tied to the property. And when I say private market housing, these are properties that do not have long-term affordability restriction attached to the property, but instead rent levels are determined by property owners based on factors such as market conditions, building conditions and amenities, and local policies. So that bucket includes rental housing with market rate rents, but it also includes rentals where rent is below market rate from various reasons, but not because of the long-term property restrictions that are true for subsidized affordable housing. So again, lots of terms here. There's examples on this slide around what we mean, but yeah, subsidized affordable housing is long-term affordability attached to the property. Private market housing is essentially all other rentals. And in these rentals are renters who are experiencing increasing cost burdens. On the left shows cost burden households who pay more than 30% of monthly income for housing. And on the right are severely cost burden renters who pay more than 50%. And this data applies to both buckets of housing. Renters who are in subsidized affordable housing still experience cost burden. And the US is seeing that the amount of cost burden renters is increasing while the supply of below market rate units is shrinking. And of course, longstanding discrimination in housing, employment, and education means that Black, Indigenous, and people of color or BIPOC households are disproportionately impacted by these cost burdens. And in any unit with rent levels that are below market rate, whether it's subsidized or on the private rental market, housing quality is often the trade-off. This is true for public housing, for nonprofit LIHTC housing, for quote unquote naturally occurring affordable housing. And additionally, more and more studies that focus on specific cities or locations are finding that rental buildings are not facing one isolated housing quality issue. And so this graphic is from 2017, so it's fairly outdated for New York, but it speaks to both these points that the market rate rental housing and the owner occupied housing show much fewer maintenance issues compared to all the other types of below market rate rental housing. And this also shows that these rental units are facing 3+ maintenance issues, not just one. So in practice, as many of you know, this means that a single building may need an elevator repair, roof repairs, lead abatement, attic air sealing, floodproofing, replacement of an old water heater, and installation of air conditioning, all as top priorities. So rental buildings, especially below market rate rentals, need what we call comprehensive upgrades. Comprehensive upgrades include retrofits across these different categories here on the right. So upgrades that make buildings safe, healthy, and accessible for occupants, and also address climate resilience, electrification of building systems, and more. And upgrades, again, as many of you in this room know, must be sequenced considering build
Right.
And while these retrofits, while the demand for these retrofits is clear, it's critical that we understand the ways in which building upgrades can exacerbate the renter cost burdens I spoke to, by resulting in raised rents, increased utility bills, tenant harassment, and or temporary or permanent tenant displacement. And these outcomes have all been documented results from local and national sources around after retrofits. And while the risk of each of these may increase or decrease depending on if you live in subsidized housing or private market housing, all tenants face some level and some type of these risks. And just want to pause here and plug a few of these sources on this slide. These graphics come from Sage. They have multiple reports on the intersection of renter protections and decarbonization retrofits, particularly in California. Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies does their annual report on the state of the nation's housing. And National Low Income Housing Coalition just published a national renter survey, which has some solid and unique data around accessibility needs, safety and quality, things like that. So those are, and many others are great spaces to dig into this a little bit more. So this status quo that I've been speaking to, where owners are performing one-off Band-Aid repairs rather than comprehensive upgrades, are paying for repairs through rent increases, or are just chronically deferring maintenance entirely. This status quo is ultimately leading buildings towards this crisis point where the housing quality concerns in these below market rate units is putting pressure on owners in one way or another to transition from below market rate to market rate rents, which would impact not just the tenants in that building, but local and regional supply of affordable housing. And there are many reasons for this status quo, many of which we won't be able to dive into today. But one of the reasons for this is because of our fragmented funding and financing landscape. And this is also where some solutions and opportunities lie for us to intervene before this crisis point, achieve our shared goals across protecting housing affordability while also improving housing quality and achieving our climate goals. So digging into that, the kinds of comprehensive retrofit projects that many rental buildings need generally require combining multiple sources of capital into a capital stack. And this slide really speaks to the process of capital stacking. Many of you may be very familiar with this, others, this may be brand new. But ultimately, it's important to consider that for the capital stack process, these arrows are going in both directions because the process is not linear. For steps 1 and 2, what we've learned is that some owners may first identify sources of capital and then think about what kind of retrofits they can get done in their buildings, while others may know their building needs and then go out and seek funding for it. And then steps 3 through 5 are typically when quote unquote value engineering occurs, which is a financing term of art when retrofit scopes get reduced to better align with the available funding. And so this is when the priorities identified during steps 2 may have to be compromised. Many of us in the room know this is also when the resilience and energy upgrades that we'd love to see are often deemed non-urgent and cut from retrofit scopes in order to prioritize essential repairs. And each step of this process could have its own presentation. So again, a lot we won't be able to dig into, but we do have some key considerations for the different types of capital that we hope can be helpful for you all. So this is a slightly more detailed list of different buckets of capital that I'll go through. And these are largely informed by BEI's work across cities like Philadelphia, Boston, Denver, as well as states and nationally. But this list is certainly not comprehensive. And of course, we'll have localized considerations across cities. So for owner equity and reserves, most owners typically do not have sufficient reserves to fully fund these types of comprehensive retrofit projects out of pocket. Conventional loans can help finance retrofit projects, but ultimately must be repaid with interest. And private market rental owners will seek to recover those costs. And the most common approach is through rent increases wherever possible. On the other side, in subsidized rental housing, we've heard from stakeholders that generally owners will not borrow new or additional conventional debt on top of what they've already financed for a preservation project. So ultimately, we cannot rely on these two buckets to do this work equitably. And the next buckets are really critical to reduce debt that's needed that will preserve affordability levels. For subsidized affordable housing, public subsidies are often the foundation of capital stacks, making comprehensive retrofits financially feasible. This bucket includes federal LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit, and the Federal Home Loan Bank, as well as others. And the amount of each of these sources varies across jurisdictions. These subsidies are also highly competitive and reach only a small share of projects per year. And they're typically catered to the subsidized affordable housing bucket, which is already the smaller share of rental housing, thinking back to the 90-10 pie chart I started with. So it's also important to think about local public subsidies for rental housing retrofit financing that cities can put out, often in the form of notice of funding availability or NOFAs. And we've seen that bucket play a really critical role also in closing capital gaps, but especially around flexibility where you can cater to both private rental market and subsidized rentals, not just subsidized rentals that the federal sources often focus on. And then for direct grants, incentive programs, utility rebates, many of which I'm sure have been mentioned today, and where there's no, repayment required, these options typically operate as independent programs with specific requirements and timelines, and are often tied to specific equipment or types of retrofits, which are great for reducing kind of overall project costs. But an important consideration for these options is around how to better design these dollars to fit into a capital stack. Again, understanding that many rental buildings need comprehensive, well-sequenced upgrades rather than one-off upgrades. So that can be through program design updates that may be related to staff time and coordination with owners, or it may be adjusting program rules and eligibility constraints, things like that. And then finally is this specialized financing bucket. This really focuses on the role of what may be referred to as mission-driven lenders, which could include community development financing institutions or CDFIs. It could include green banks or philanthropic organizations that offer financing mechanisms. And it requires these types of lenders to enable projects where conventional financing and conventional debt is not appropriate or may negatively impact housing affordability. In Boston, we've really been grappling with the concept of catalytic capital and how that type of gap financing can inspire additional private and public dollars that make these projects feasible. I've also seen capital stack examples that got to 90% of cost coverage through public subsidies and grants. But if a CDFI hadn't stepped in with flexible financing for that final 10%, then the project likely would not have been able to happen. So this is really critical for that gap financing. So, to summarize this section, most owners can't do comprehensive retrofits alone or out of pocket. Debt from conventional financing has limitations, especially risks to rent levels and tenants. Public subsidies create feasibility. Really, capital stacks with public subsidies are achieving full cost coverage. But the key is to make sure that these don't just go to subsidized affordable housing and are also available for the private rental market. Public incentives and utility rebates help lower the total project costs, especially for equipment and other hard costs. And the key is figuring out how can these more seamlessly fit into capital stacks, and how can owners access them with fewer barriers in order to include them in capital stacks for comprehensive upgrades. And then specialized financing fills remaining gaps and often really relies on having access or relationships with more mission-driven lenders. So key takeaways for the whole presentation, then we'll go into Q&A, are that rental housing faces overlapping challenges that are tailored to different housing types and designed to protect residents. Successful projects align funding for housing quality, resilience, health and safety, and energy improvements to be sequenced well based on building science and priority tenant needs. No single funding source will make projects pencil. Different rental housing requires different financing strategies, and subsidized affordable housing and in private rent market housing, they have different business models, financing constraints, and policy environments. So there's no one size fits all, unfortunately, but comprehensive upgrades are achievable. Cities can preserve affordable housing at the building level and at the city level, improving building quality, reducing emissions, and protecting tenants all at the same time. I really want to emphasize this is not necessarily a technology problem. Of course, there's room for tech innovation here, but mostly this is a funding and coordination problem. And so I want to emphasize that partnerships across energy, housing, and finance, and across public, private, nonprofit, philanthropy, are really what make this work achievable. And I'll also, just to throw out a few more resources, I've mentioned a few of BEI's projects like in Boston and Philly. Unfortunately, neither of those are posted publicly yet, but they will be soon. So for now, just a shout out of, on a few other BEI sources. We love a one-stop shop model at BEI. We call these retrofit navigators and have a few solid resources on our website about program design to address these issues. And of course, would love to shout out other orgs across the country working on this, like LISC chapters across the US are leading some great partner collaboration efforts. I know Redwood Energy, you all have some resources out there on multifamily retrofit, full electrification projects. Here in LA, Retrofit LA is doing a great job at showcasing successful capital stacks for these comprehensive projects, which is every capital stack is an opportunity to learn about what's working and what's not. So seeing those case studies has been really helpful. And of course, every city has a landscape of tenant rights organizations who are really, closely familiar with whatever the top housing quality issues are and what the specific requests are around tenant protections. So there are many people working on this, but that's all I've got for today. I'd love to hear from folks in the room. And I know I haven't been looking at the chat, but I've been getting the notification. So apologies. But yeah, I would love to hear what people think.
Woo! Hey, good job. Good job. Hey, give me a little cheers. Okay. So, let's go over to where'd the chat go? Chat. There. Buttons. Um,
I didn't see anything in the chat. I think they were all reflections on the previous speaker.
okay. Then, well,
Got it. Okay.
well, one of the things that struck me was your slide showing the relative amount of repairs needed. Do you mind going back to that one? It's like maybe
Definitely.
there it was. Okay.
Hmm.
So in my head, one of the places
Hmm.
that's easiest to grab all the finances together are places like public housing by NYCHA, right? They're the ones who are
Hmm.
leading the electrification effort with stoves that Sazi spoke about prior to your presentation or two prior.
Hmm.
That's and there's 37% of them have significant problems. So that for me is like, okay, that's the easier place because the public
Hmm.
subsidies are there, but the challenges are harder. I have very little experience with market rate, and I was wondering, could you expand a
Hmm.
little bit on, like Aisha spoke a little bit earlier, and she was
Hmm.
speaking to how she felt like the rents were able to encapsulate the cost of the solar that were put up on the roof.
Hmm.
But it was in a like a kind of a loose way. It wasn't like it was specific. But that's then
Hmm.
if you raise rents specifically because you did something like solar, it seems like that falls afoul of what Sage is concerned about, is that it would then essentially force move outs.
Hmm.
Even if the utility
Definitely.
bills go down dollar for dollar, like ideally there's
Hmm.
no difference. Like,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah. Well, oh, sorry. Go for it. Mhm.
no, please. And so I was just going to ask you, like, so
Mhm.
tell me more about market rate electrification. What are you seeing?
Well, okay, yeah. So I do want to start out by saying this is outdated. So NYCHA data
It's
will,
okay.
like,
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully it'll be shifted at this point because they are doing a ton, not just in stoves, but also um
Hmm.
window air conditions, heat pumps, things like that.
Yeah.
So, and they're also really leading public housing around innovative financing, not just public subsidies, but other types of financing mechanisms. So, yay for NYCHA.
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of um, like when rent increases happen and why, it really does get into owner decision making. I think we for unsubsidized, so for private rental market housing, there's not long-term restrictions attached to the property. um we heard feedback that usage savings is typically not going to shift owner decision making around, yeah, whether or not they're going to do it. And so if the cost, the upfront costs of installation and materials and labor and all the development costs aren't covered at the time of capital stacking, um, private rental owners will seek cost recovery one way or another. And typically that's through rent increases, which is why it's so critical for all of us to do this collaboration and try to get the cost coverage, the upfront cost coverage, because that will directly reduce risk to tenant or to rent increases. But depending on the type of housing, owners can still decide to increase rent if they're evaluating that their property value went up and they're not being regulated in one way or another. And so it's not a do this and don't do that. Like, tenant protection policies and other mechanisms still need to be considered to protect rent levels. But yeah, we've seen that when 100% cost coverage can be achieved at the capital stacking process, the risk to rent going up later is less than when owners are only relying on their reserves or conventional debt. Then the risk is much higher to rent going up.
So this is I have a deep conflict of interest, and then Cooper has a good question here. Yours is next, Cooper, but I'm just dying to ask you this. So in our line of business at Redwood Energy, we predict utility bills as low as, say, 12 or $6. And that allows the owner to then raise rents in a regulated way, dollar for dollar. As the utility bills go down, they can raise the rent up, and it's capped at 30%, which you pointed out is still a burden, but that's the cap, is 30% for rent and utilities. So that's what we do every day, is essentially facilitate people raising rent in subsidized regulated housing in a regulated way so that the investments of money go into people's own apartments and they pay for it. But they pay for it in a regulated way and it's proportional to their benefit, like exactly proportional to their benefit, ideally, or very closely to it. So is that wrong?
I mean, I wouldn't say I'm the authority on what is wrong and right, but I will say, going back to this data,
Hmm.
cost burden is going up for everyone.
Hmm.
So what worked historically may not work now. It may not have the same outcomes this year, next year, over the next 5 years. And I think, yeah, tenant rights groups, advocacy organizations around affordability, elevate these already existing costs impacts to tenants. And so I think it's, if we want to ensure that this transition can be equitable and not impact affordability, it's up to us to get creative. So, I'm not going to stand here and say stop doing everything you're doing, but I think I'd
No,
love
I
to
mean, if
like
anything,
build these collaborations to like get more creative around, well, what other options exist? How can we reduce these cost pass-throughs onto tenants, whether it's through utility bills or rent or any kind of cost impacts.
if
And also what
Oh yeah,
solutions
okay.
are best are most appropriate for different income levels. So when
Definitely.
tenants are not protected, those kind of cost recovery mechanisms might work for moderate income households that can manage their existing cost burden. But if it were to, if you're talking very low income and they have no protections or subsidy, they're not in subsidized affordable housing,
Mm-hmm.
potentially that mechanism would work because they can't afford their existing costs, let alone increases. We need to see decreases.
the Dave Enter points out that they can get health and comfort benefits it too, even if it's a cost neutral due to a formula of rent going
Mm-hmm.
up as utility bills go down. And I want to give Cooper last question, which was, he says, are we suboptimally delaying clean energy retrofits by coupling them too closely to addressing deferred maintenance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think this goes into, let's see, which slide around. There's building science reasons to couple these, as I think this room is really firmly aware of kind of what we need to sequence around before we seal the building. We need to remediate mold, we need to remediate pests, like those kinds of building science reasons to sequence these. But also priority tenant needs. So, in subsidized affordable units, um, these units are often serving priority populations, including the elderly. Like accessibility needs may be the priority over a electric stove, and it's important. And in a world with limited funding, we need to consider the tenant needs just as much as the building science.